I still remember the sound of my own heartbeat outside that hotel room door. Loud. Fast. Like it already knew something my mind wasn't ready to accept. My name is Claire. I was 34 years old, married for 7 years, and until that night in Chicago, I believed I understood my life completely. I believed I knew the man I slept beside every night. I believed our story was steady, safe, ordinary in the best possible way. I didn't know that everything I thought was solid was about to crack open in front of me, in a hallway that smelled like fresh carpet and hotel soap, under lights that were too bright for what I was about to see. Let me take you back a little further than the hallway. Back to before the door. Back to when my life still felt whole, when I still thought love was something you earned through patience and honesty, and that once you'd earned it, it stayed earned. I met Daniel when I was 26 at a mutual friend's birthday dinner in a small Italian restaurant that no longer exists. He was sitting across the table, laughing at something quietly, the kind of laugh that didn't need an audience. I remember thinking he looked like the kind of person who noticed things, who noticed when your glass was empty before you did, who noticed when a conversation had shifted the mood in a room. That night, he asked me exactly 2 questions about myself and remembered both answers 3 weeks later when we ran into each other again at a coffee shop near my apartment. I thought that meant something. I still think, in some strange way, that it did, just not what I believed it meant at the time. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. He did it on a Tuesday, which he always said was funny because Tuesdays are nobody's favorite day, and he wanted our love to make even the most forgettable day unforgettable. He got down on one knee in our kitchen, no restaurant, no crowd, no big performance, just the 2 of us, a pot of pasta boiling over slightly on the stove behind him because he'd forgotten to turn down the heat in his nervousness. I laughed so hard I almost couldn't say yes. That memory used to make me smile. Now it sits in a strange, complicated place in my chest, still sweet, but bruised. We built a life together. Not a flashy one. A real one. He worked as a regional sales manager for a mid-sized medical equipment company, which meant he traveled often, sometimes twice a month, sometimes more, depending on the quarter. I worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, building a small but steady client base of local businesses and, eventually, a few larger clients who found me through referrals. My hours were flexible. His were not. It became the natural rhythm of our marriage, me at my desk by the window, him rolling a suitcase out the door every other Sunday night, a quick kiss goodbye, a promise to call when he landed. I never minded his travel. I trusted him. Trust wasn't something I gave carelessly. It was something I built with him, brick by brick, over years of small honesties. He told me when he made mistakes at work. He told me when he felt insecure about turning 35 without the promotion he wanted. He told me, once, that he'd had a moment of attraction toward a coworker years earlier and nothing had happened, but he wanted me to know because keeping it a secret felt worse than admitting it. I remember being proud of him for that honesty. I remember thinking, this is what a strong marriage looks like, not the absence of temptation, but the choice to be transparent about it. Looking back now, I wonder how much of that early honesty was real and how much of it was simply Daniel testing how much trust he could bank for later, like a man depositing coins into a jar he intended to spend all at once, all in secret. Years down the line. That week, the week everything changed, our anniversary was approaching. 7 years. Not a round number, but it mattered to me because 7 was the year he once said would be the real test, back when we were newlyweds joking about how many couples fall apart before then. We hadn't fallen apart. We had made it, or so I believed with my whole chest. We'd survived a miscarriage 2 years earlier, a devastating loss we'd grieved together in a way that had, strangely, brought us closer instead of pulling us apart. We'd survived a stretch where his job nearly got cut during a company restructuring, 6 tense months of budgeting and late-night conversations about what we'd do if the worst happened. We had survived, and surviving together had felt, to me, like proof. Daniel had a work trip planned to Chicago that week. 3 nights, a regional managers conference, nothing unusual. He'd done this exact trip, to this exact type of conference, at least 4 times before. But something in me, Some soft, romantic impulse decided I wanted to surprise him. I pictured his face when I knocked on his door. I imagined ordering room service, laughing about how ridiculous the idea was, maybe even sneaking out to see the city lights together like we used to when we first started dating. Back when a walk through a cold city at midnight felt like the most exciting thing in the world simply because we were doing it together. I didn't tell him. That was the whole point of a surprise, wasn't it? I booked a flight for the second night of his trip, using a small bonus I'd gotten from a design project that had wrapped up early. I packed a small bag, the blue dress he loved, the one he said made my eyes look brighter, along with a bottle of wine from the little vineyard we'd visited on our honeymoon, the label slightly faded now but still recognizable. I remember standing in front of the mirror before I left, smiling at my own reflection, feeling like the luckiest woman in the world. I felt like the main character in my own love story, flying across the country just to see the man I adored, carrying wine from the place where our marriage had officially begun. The flight was smooth. I texted my sister, Rachel, from the airport. "Guess what I'm doing?" I wrote, adding 3 heart emojis. She replied instantly, "Please tell me you're finally surprising him in Chicago." I had told her the plan weeks ago, sworn her to secrecy, made her promise not to say a word to anyone, especially not to Daniel. She was thrilled for me. She always said Daniel and I were the couple she measured her own relationships against, the proof that steady, patient love could actually work out in the end. When I landed, the city greeted me with cold wind and golden evening light bouncing off tall glass buildings. I took a cab straight to his hotel, one of those elegant downtown places with a lobby that smelled like eucalyptus and ambition, the kind of place where business travelers moved briskly across marble floors with rolling suitcases and phones pressed to their ears. I checked the confirmation email one more time, room 914, and felt my stomach flutter with excitement, the kind of nervous, giddy energy I hadn't felt in years. Not since our earliest dates when every moment together still felt slightly unbelievable. I want you to understand something before I go further. That flutter, that nervous joy wasn't fear. It wasn't a warning. I had no reason to expect anything but happiness on the other side of that door. If somebody had told me, standing in that elevator watching the floor numbers climb, that my whole world was about to shatter, I would have laughed. I would have said, "Not us. We're different. We've already survived the hard parts." That's the cruel thing about betrayal. It never announces itself. It waits until you're smiling, until you're standing in an elevator holding a bottle of wine from your honeymoon, believing with your whole heart that the man on the other side of a door is exactly who he's always claimed to be. The elevator doors opened on the 9th floor. Soft carpet, dim gold lighting, the low hum of a hallway that felt like it belonged in a movie, the kind of quiet luxury that makes you feel like something good is about to happen. I walked toward room 914, my heels clicking quietly against the carpet, my heart pounding with anticipation instead of dread, rehearsing in my head the exact words I'd say when he opened the door, something playful, something like room service. "And I come with wine." I raised my hand to knock. And in that half-second pause, right before my knuckles touched the wood, I heard something from inside. A woman's laugh. Not loud. Not obvious. Soft, familiar sounding, the kind of laugh that comes from comfort, not from a stranger passing through a hallway. My hand froze in the air, suspended, as my mind scrambled to build an innocent explanation. A colleague. A group dinner that had spilled back into his room. A television left on too loud. For a moment, I told myself it was the television. A show, a commercial, anything but what my gut was already screaming at me. I knocked anyway, my knuckles trembling slightly against the door. There was a pause. Movement. Muffled voices, low and quick, the particular rustle of 2 people scrambling rather than one person simply getting up to answer a knock. And then the door opened. Daniel stood there in a white hotel robe, his hair damp like he'd just showered, his face frozen in a mixture of shock and something else, something I couldn't name yet, but would soon understand as guilt. Behind him, sitting on the edge of the bed, wrapped in the other hotel robe, was a woman I did not recognize. Her hair was messy in a way that told its own story. She looked at me the way you look at a fire alarm you weren't expecting to go off, startled, caught, unsure whether to run or explain. I stood in that doorway, frozen, my small overnight bag hanging from my shoulder, the blue dress and the honeymoon wine folded neatly inside it, my heart still racing from the excitement of a surprise that had just turned into the worst discovery of my life. "Claire," Daniel started, but I didn't hear the rest. Everything around me blurred into a strange, slow silence. I remember the sound of the air conditioning humming. I remember the smell of his cologne mixed with something floral that wasn't mine. I remember thinking, absurdly, that the carpet in that hallway was a very ugly shade of maroon, the kind of detail your mind grabs onto when it can't process the larger thing happening in front of it. I didn't scream. I didn't cry, not yet. I just stood there, staring at the two of them, feeling something inside me, trust, maybe, or the last piece of innocence I had left, crack straight down the middle. That was the night I stopped being the woman who believed marriage was safe just because you built it carefully. That was the night I learned that even the walls you trust the most can hide a door you never knew existed. But that moment in the hallway was only the beginning. What came after, the unraveling, the questions, the discovery of just how long this had been going on, and what I chose to do about it, that's the story I need to tell you now. I don't remember walking away from that door. I remember being in the elevator, watching my own reflection in the polished steel, looking like a stranger to myself. My makeup was still perfect. My hair was still curled the way I'd done it in my bathroom that morning, humming to myself, imagining his surprised smile. None of that matched the hollow look in my eyes, a look I didn't recognize on my own face. I checked into a different room on a different floor, 3 floors down, paying with the credit card I kept for emergencies, my hands shaking so badly it took 2 tries to sign the slip. I don't know why I stayed in the same hotel that night instead of leaving immediately. Maybe some small, foolish part of me wanted an explanation. Maybe I wasn't ready to admit that 7 years could end in a single, ordinary Tuesday-turned-Thursday hallway over a bottle of honeymoon wine I never even got to open. Daniel called my phone 11 times that night. I watched the screen light up again and again, his name glowing against the dark hotel room, and each time I let it ring out, watching it vibrate itself into silence on the nightstand. Around midnight, a text came through. "Please let me explain." It's not what it looked like. But what I didn't know that day was just how wrong that sentence would prove to be, because it was exactly what it looked like, and worse. I didn't sleep. I sat by the window of my hotel room, watching the lights of a city I didn't know, in a life I suddenly didn't recognize. I thought about our wedding day, the way he'd cried when I walked down the aisle, dabbing at his eyes with the handkerchief his grandfather had given him. I thought about the nights he'd rubbed my feet after long work days, the mornings he'd left little notes on the bathroom mirror in dry erase marker, "You've got this," or simply a small drawn heart. I thought about the miscarriage, the night he'd held me on the bathroom floor for almost an hour without saying anything, just being there, solid and present, while I fell apart. Had all of that been real? Or had I simply been the version of his life he kept for convenience, the steady harbor he returned to between storms of his own making, while some other version of him existed behind hotel doors in cities I never saw? By morning, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to fall apart in silence. I was going to find out the truth, all of it, no matter how much it hurt. I flew home a day early, changing my ticket at the gate, paying an extra fee I barely registered. Daniel tried calling again from the airport. I didn't answer. When he finally arrived home 2 days later, he'd stayed to finish the conference, which struck me as almost unbelievable at the time, that he could sit through panels on quarterly sales projections after what had happened. I was sitting at our kitchen table with his laptop open in front of me. I want to be honest, I'm not proud of going through his things. But betrayal has a way of making you desperate for facts, for proof, for something solid to hold on to in a world that had just tilted sideways. What I found wasn't a single mistake. It wasn't one weak moment in a hotel room fueled by bad judgment and a few drinks. It was a pattern. Messages going back over a year, stored in a messaging app one hadn't even known he used, hidden behind a folder labeled Work Docs. A woman named Melissa, the same woman from that hotel room, who worked at a branch office he visited regularly, roughly 4 hours from our home. Dinners, dozens of them, documented in receipts I found tucked into old email confirmations. Weekend trips disguised as extra training sessions, complete with calendar entries he'd carefully labeled to sound mundane. Photos I wish I could unsee. Words of affection he used to whisper to me, recycled and repurposed, sent to someone else in messages timestamped from our own bed, while I slept beside him believing he was simply checking work email one last time before turning off the light. When he walked through the door and saw me sitting there, laptop open, tears streaming silently down my face, he didn't rush to comfort me. He didn't kneel down and beg for forgiveness the way people do in movies. Instead, his shoulders sagged, like he was almost relieved the secret was finally out in the open, like carrying it in silence had exhausted him more than the guilt of what he'd actually done. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said quietly, setting his suitcase down by the door as though this were an ordinary homecoming. "How far did you mean for it to go, Daniel?" My voice came out steadier than I expected, even as my hands trembled in my lap. "A few dinners? A few lies? Because it looks like you built an entire second life." He didn't have a real answer. He just stood there, guilt written all over his face, offering excuses that all sounded the same: stress from work, feeling unappreciated. It just happened. As if a year of secret meetings and staged business trips could just happen, the way rain just happens, or traffic just happens, rather than being the result of dozens of small, deliberate choices made one after another. I want to pause here and be honest with you about something. In the days that followed, I didn't feel like a strong woman standing tall against injustice. I felt broken. I felt stupid for not noticing sooner, even though there was nothing to notice. He had been careful, calculated even, deleting messages, timing his calls, keeping his phone locked with a passcode he'd once joked was just habit from work. I felt embarrassed to tell my friends and family, worried they would look at me with pity instead of understanding. Betrayal doesn't just break your heart, it breaks your confidence in your own judgment, makes you question every memory you thought you could trust. I cried in the shower so the sound of the water would hide it. I cried during grocery store trips when I passed the aisle where we used to argue playfully over what cereal to buy. I cried in my car outside our house, unable to walk in and face the life we had built, now hollowed out from the inside like a house with a beautiful front door and nothing but rot behind the walls. The first person I told, aside from Rachel, was our close friend Priya, who had known us since before we were married. I remember sitting across from her at a small cafe, my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee I never drank, watching her face shift from confusion to disbelief to a kind of quiet fury on my behalf. "He always seemed so steady," she kept saying, as though repeating it might undo what had happened. Telling her made it real in a new way. Once someone else knew, I couldn't pretend, even for a few private hours, that it might have been a misunderstanding. Telling my parents was harder still. My mother, who had always liked Daniel, who had told me at my wedding that she'd never seen a man look at his bride the way he looked at me, went quiet on the phone for a long moment before saying, in a voice tight with restrained anger, "Do you need me to come there?" "I can be there by tomorrow." My father, a man of few words, simply said, "Whatever you decide, we're behind you completely," and then asked a single practical question. "Do you have a lawyer yet?" That question, oddly, steadied me more than any comfort could have. It reminded me that grief and strategy could exist in the same breath. Daniel's parents, when they eventually found out, reacted with a mixture of shame and denial that surprised me. His mother called me directly, crying, insisting Daniel wasn't raised this way, as though his upbringing could somehow undo what he'd chosen to do as a grown man. It wasn't cruelty on her part. I understood that then, and I understand it now, but it added one more layer of exhaustion to weeks that were already unbearably heavy. I called Rachel again that first weekend home. She drove 3 hours to be with me, no questions asked, arriving at nearly midnight with a bag of takeout and a look on her face that told me she already suspected something was terribly wrong before I said a single word. When I told her everything, she didn't say, "I told you so," even though she admitted later she'd always found something a little too smooth about Daniel's charm, something rehearsed she could never quite put her finger on. She just held me while I finally let myself sob the way I hadn't allowed myself to in front of him. "You are not what he did to you," she told me, holding my face in her hands the way she used to when we were kids and I'd fallen off my bike. "You get to decide what happens next." Those words stayed with me. You get to decide what happens next. I spent the following weeks in a strange, quiet state of transformation. I moved into Rachel's guest room, bringing only what I could fit in 2 suitcases, leaving the rest of our shared life sitting untouched in the house I couldn't yet bring myself to sort through. I met with a lawyer, someone recommended by a friend who had gone through a similarly painful divorce 2 years earlier. Her name was Angela Ruiz, and she had a calm, unshakable directness that I found strangely comforting in the middle of so much chaos. "We're going to build this carefully," she told me in our first meeting, sliding a legal pad across the table. "Emotion is allowed at home. In here, we deal in facts." I started documenting everything: messages, financial records, hotel receipts I found buried in old email confirmations, patterns of business trips that didn't match actual business schedules according to his own company calendar, which I still had partial access to from an old shared login we'd never bothered to separate. I built spreadsheets late into the night at Rachel's kitchen table, tracking dates, locations, amounts, cross-referencing them against his actual work itinerary whenever I could find it. It was tedious, painful work, reliving each lie in granular detail, but it gave me something my grief desperately needed: a sense of control. Daniel, for his part, oscillated between guilt and defensiveness in a way that gave me emotional whiplash. Some days he sent long messages apologizing, promising counseling, promising change, describing in aching detail how much he regretted hurting me. Other days he grew cold, implying that I was overreacting, that plenty of marriages survive a mistake, that I was throwing away 7 years over one bad decision, conveniently reshaping over a year of calculated deception into a single, forgivable slip. One evening, he showed up unannounced at Rachel's house, standing on the porch in the rain, asking to talk. Rachel wanted to turn him away, but I stepped outside instead, arms crossed against the cold, and let him speak. He told me he loved me, that Melissa had just been an escape from the stress, that he wanted to fix things, go to therapy, start over. I listened to every word. And then I asked him one simple question: "If I hadn't flown to Chicago, would you have ever told me?" He was silent for a long moment, rain soaking into his jacket, and that silence answered the question more honestly than anything he could have said. During this time, I also learned something important about Melissa, the woman from the hotel room. Through a mutual contact at Daniel's company, a coworker named Tasha, who had grown uneasy watching the situation unfold and eventually reached out to me privately, I discovered Melissa hadn't known Daniel was married, at least not at first. When she found out the truth, months into their relationship, she had confronted him, furious and hurt in her own right. He had told her I was basically already leaving him, that our marriage was over in every way but paperwork, a convenient fiction that let him keep both of us stitched into his life without either of us knowing the other existed. When I reached out to Melissa directly, not out of anger toward her, but out of a need to understand the full picture, she was shaken. We spoke on the phone for nearly 2 hours, both of us occasionally crying, comparing timelines, realizing just how methodically Daniel had lied to each of us. She apologized, genuinely, for the pain she had unknowingly caused, and shared screenshots that confirmed just how deliberately he had manipulated both of our trust, including messages where he described his marriage to me in terms so bleak and false I barely recognized the relationship he was describing. In an odd way, that conversation didn't deepen my anger toward her. It deepened my clarity about who Daniel really was, a man capable of constructing 2 entirely separate emotional realities and maintaining them simultaneously for over a year, without a single visible crack, until the night I happened to knock on the wrong door at exactly the right moment. I stopped seeing myself as a victim of one betrayal. I started seeing the full architecture of it. The careful lies, the calculated timing, the way he had built an entire secondary life, while I believed we were building our future together, brick by brick, the same way I once believed our marriage itself had been built. And once I saw it clearly, I stopped grieving the marriage I thought I had. I started preparing, methodically and deliberately, for the life I was about to build without him. But what I didn't know then was that my story wasn't going to end with quiet acceptance or a simple, private divorce. Because as I dug deeper into the financial side of our marriage, preparing for the legal battle ahead, I discovered something else, something that would change the entire direction of what came next, and would ensure that the truth of what Daniel had done wouldn't stay quietly contained within the walls of our house. While reviewing our joint accounts for the divorce paperwork, sitting cross-legged on Rachel's guest bed with 3 months of statements spread out around me, I found irregularities I hadn't noticed before. Transfers to an account I didn't recognize, small enough at first glance to be overlooked, but recurring with unmistakable regularity, every 2 or 3 weeks, like clockwork. Payments for hotel stays and dinners that had quietly drained thousands of dollars from money we had been saving together for years, money I had contributed to just as much as he had, money that was supposed to become the down payment on the home we always talked about buying, the one with the wraparound porch he used to describe in such loving detail that I could picture it perfectly, down to the color of the front door. He hadn't just betrayed my trust emotionally. He had spent our shared future funding a relationship built on lies, without ever once discussing it with me, without ever once considering that this money represented years of my own hard work too, late nights finishing design projects, weekends turned down with friends so I could hit a deadline, all of it quietly diverted into hotel rooms in a city 4 hours away. I brought the full spreadsheet to Angela, laying it out for her the way she'd taught me to, dates, amounts, cross-referenced against his actual work calendar, against Melissa's own account of their timeline, against messages I'd saved and printed and organized into a binder that had grown thick over the weeks. She flipped through it slowly, her expression sharpening with each page. "This isn't just heartbreak, Claire," she said finally, closing the binder and looking directly at me. "This is documented financial betrayal, using marital assets to fund an undisclosed affair over an extended period. Depending on our state's laws, this can significantly affect asset division. Are you ready to use it? I want to be clear about something here. What happened next wasn't about revenge in the way movies often portray it. No shouting matches in public, no dramatic scenes designed purely to humiliate him, no midnight phone calls to his boss dripping with spite. What I wanted wasn't chaos. What I wanted was the truth to be visible and accountability to be unavoidable in the calm, procedural language of a legal process that couldn't be talked around or charmed away the way Daniel had always managed to talk his way around uncomfortable conversations at home. "I'm ready," I told her. The months that followed the filing were a strange blend of exhausting and clarifying. Mediation sessions where Daniel's new lawyer tried, gently at first and then more forcefully, to characterize the affair as a brief lapse rather than the sustained pattern the evidence clearly showed. Angela met every attempt with the same unshakable calm, laying documented dates against his claims one by one, watching each softened version of events collapse under its own inconsistency. I remember one mediation session in particular, sitting at a long conference table with too much fluorescent lighting, when Daniel's lawyer suggested that the financial transfers could be explained as ordinary business expenses, later reimbursed. Angela simply slid across a printed comparison, his actual submitted expense reports beside the personal account transfers, showing a gap of nearly $19,000 that had never been reimbursed by anyone. Quietly siphoned instead from the account we had built together for a future he'd never actually intended to share honestly. Daniel's face, across that table, cycled through something I can only describe as the slow unraveling of a man who had always believed he was clever enough to manage every version of his life without consequence. For the first time since that hotel hallway, I watched him understand, fully and completely, that this wasn't going to be resolved with a well-timed apology and a promise to do better. The divorce settlement, when it finally came, reflected the truth of what had happened. Instead of splitting everything evenly, as Daniel had assumed we would when this first began, the court took into account the money he had secretly spent on his affair, categorizing it appropriately as dissipation of marital assets. I was awarded a significantly larger share of our remaining joint assets, A decision that felt less like punishment and more like simple fairness, my future being protected from a debt of betrayal I never agreed to help pay for. Daniel was stunned. I remember the day we signed the final paperwork, sitting across from each other in a quiet conference room, lawyers on either side, a box of tissues sitting untouched in the middle of the table like some sad, ironic centerpiece. He looked at me with something that resembled disbelief, as if some part of him truly believed he could betray me for over a year, spend our shared savings on hotel rooms and dinners with someone else, lie to two different women simultaneously about the state of his own marriage, and still walk away with half of everything as if none of it had actually happened. "You really went all in on this," he said quietly, almost bitterly, as we finished signing, his pen tapping restlessly against the table. "No, Daniel," I said, meeting his eyes without flinching, my voice steadier than I ever thought it could be in that moment. "You went all in on this. A year ago. Every time you booked another hotel room. Every time you told her our marriage was already over. Every time you looked me in the eye at home and let me believe we were fine. I just made sure the truth had consequences instead of disappearing quietly like you were counting on." I didn't yell. I didn't cry in that room. I felt something steadier than anger, a quiet, grounded sense of justice. Not because the money mattered more than the heartbreak, but because for the first time since that hotel door opened, I felt like the story was finally being told accurately. Not softened for his comfort. Not minimized to protect his reputation. Just true in black and white, signed and finalized. Word got around, as it tends to in small professional circles, especially once financial records become part of a legal proceeding that other people occasionally glimpse. Melissa, upon learning the full extent of what Daniel had done not just to me, but to the story he had told her, the version of events he'd used to justify his own choices to her as well, chose to end things with him completely. And did so publicly enough within their shared professional circle that it became difficult for him to maintain the polished image he'd always cultivated. She later told me, in one of our last conversations, that finding out the full truth had been its own kind of wake-up call for her too, a painful but necessary one. We didn't become friends exactly, but there was an unexpected mutual respect between us, two women who had both been deceived by the same carefully constructed lies, both left to rebuild their trust in their own separate ways. As for Daniel, the fallout extended beyond our marriage. His company, upon learning that a significant number of his business trips over the past year had actually been personal trips disguised as work travel, trips that had been expensed, in some cases, to the company itself. Receipts padded and misrepresented to cover costs he didn't want appearing in our personal accounts, launched an internal review. I wasn't the one who reported it directly. Word simply travels, and financial inconsistencies rarely stay hidden once a formal audit starts asking pointed questions during unrelated litigation discovery. He lost the position he had worked so hard to build over nearly a decade, the same position that had funded all those secret hotel rooms and quiet dinners in the first place. I heard, through the same mutual contacts who had once helped me understand Melissa's side of things, that finding comparable work afterward proved far harder than he expected, in an industry where reputation moves quickly between companies that all seem to know each other. I won't pretend I felt nothing when I heard about it. There was a flicker of something, not joy exactly, but a kind of grim recognition that consequences, when they finally arrive, often arrive from directions you never expected, built from the very lies someone thought would protect them. I hadn't set out to destroy his career. I had simply told the truth when asked, documented what was real when it mattered, and the truth, once released into daylight, moved on its own momentum, far beyond anything I orchestrated. In the months that followed, I rebuilt my life slowly, deliberately, one steady choice at a time. I used part of the settlement, along with savings I'd carefully protected, to put a down payment on a small 2-bedroom house of my own, no wraparound porch, nothing like the house we used to dream about together, but a bright, sturdy little place with good light in the mornings and a kitchen window that looked out over a maple tree instead of a neighbor's fence. I painted the walls a soft, warm yellow, a color Daniel had always vetoed, calling it too much, and stood in the empty living room the day I finished, paint splattered and exhausted, feeling something I hadn't felt in almost a year: peace. I started taking my design work more seriously, picking up bigger clients, building something that was entirely mine, untouched by anyone else's compromises. Within a year, I had brought on a part-time assistant to help manage client projects, something I never would have imagined attempting while I was still quietly organizing my whole life around Daniel's travel schedule. Priya, ever loyal, became my first official client outside my existing network, hiring me to redesign the branding for the small bakery she'd always dreamed of opening. Watching her sign lease papers for that bakery, the same month my own divorce was finalized, felt like a strange, hopeful kind of symmetry, two women building new things out of what used to feel impossible. There were still hard nights. Betrayal doesn't disappear just because justice, in whatever form, has been served. I still sometimes caught myself flinching at hotel commercials on television, or feeling a strange tightness in my chest whenever I saw a couple checking into a hotel lobby, oblivious and happy the way I once was, dragging a suitcase and grinning at each other like nothing bad could possibly be waiting behind any door. Healing wasn't a straight line. It was messy, uneven, full of good weeks and sudden, unexpected bad days that would arrive without warning, triggered by something as small as a familiar cologne passing by in a grocery store aisle. But slowly the weight lifted. I started sleeping through the night again. I started laughing without that hollow echo behind it, the kind of laugh that used to catch in my throat halfway through in those first raw months. I started trusting my own judgment again, piece by piece, the same way I had once built trust with Daniel, brick by brick, except this time, I was building trust in myself, and this time, I understood exactly how strong that foundation actually was. About a year and a half after the divorce was finalized, I met someone carefully, slowly, with none of the breathless certainty I'd once felt meeting Daniel at that Italian restaurant years earlier. His name was Marcus, a structural engineer I'd been introduced to through Priya's bakery renovation, of all things. He was patient in a way that never once felt performed, and he never once made me feel foolish for needing time, for double-checking small things, for occasionally going quiet when something reminded me of what I'd survived. I wasn't in a rush this time. I understood now that love, real love, doesn't need to be rushed to be real, and that the healthiest relationships are the ones that can withstand a little healthy suspicion in their early days without buckling under it. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't have understood in that hotel hallway, frozen with my hand raised to knock, a bottle of honeymoon wine tucked uselessly into my bag. Betrayal reveals two things at once: who someone truly is beneath the version of themselves they show you, and who you truly are beneath the pain they cause you. Daniel showed me, in the end, that he was a man capable of living two lives at once, comfortable with deception as long as it served his comfort, willing to spend our shared future to fund a lie rather than simply tell me the truth and let me make my own informed choices. But I discovered something too, that I was capable of walking through devastation without losing myself completely. That I could feel shattered and still stand up straight in a mediation room. That I could grieve a marriage and still fight fiercely, methodically, for what was fair. That justice doesn't always look like revenge in the dramatic sense. Sometimes it simply looks like refusing to let someone else's lies define the ending of your story, and instead making sure the truth gets the final word. If there's one thing I want you to take from everything I've shared, it's this: betrayal will always try to convince you that you were foolish for trusting, foolish for loving fully, foolish for believing in something good. Don't let it. Trusting someone with your whole heart was never the mistake. The mistake was entirely his, built quietly over months and months of choices that had nothing to do with your worth, and everything to do with his own willingness to deceive. I flew to Chicago that night expecting to surprise the man I loved. Instead, I found the truth about who he really was. It shattered me, yes, completely, for a while. But it also, in the strangest and most unexpected way, set me free and gave me back a version of myself I didn't even know I'd been missing. And if you're sitting somewhere right now, holding a secret of your own that you're afraid to face, or living beside someone else's secret without yet knowing it, I hope my story reminds you of something important. The truth, however painful, is always better than a beautifully decorated lie. Because only the truth can lead you somewhere real. And only from something real can you finally begin to heal and build a life sturdy enough that nothing hidden behind a closed door can ever shatter it again.